Hello, welcome to Communications 108, Communications and Social Interaction. Today we'll be covering Chapter 6, Effective Listening. So, what is the opposite of talking? Most of you would probably say listening, but you're wrong. Most of us, when someone else is talking, actually are waiting to talk. We're waiting for that moment when the other person takes a breath and we can jump in and say our piece, especially when we're having a fight with our love muffin or with someone else, our friend. Now, in the business world, listening is the skill we use most throughout our day, especially in management. In management, we spend 65 to 90% of the working day listening to someone and processing that information. More importantly, when we are listening to people, we only remember about 20% of what we hear. So it's important that we take notes when we listen, because not 80% of what we're hearing goes right out one ear after it comes in the other. So that listening is not a passive skill, it is an active skill. So as an employee or a manager, when you're listening, it is a very active skill set. When you're not listening, mistakes get made, productivity suffers, profits decline. When someone doesn't feel heard, they stop contributing. They're just not working at the level they should be working at. And customers ultimately go elsewhere. In a personal relationship, if a person doesn't feel heard, the relationship is often over at that point. So let's talk about the difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is the physical process of letting in audible stimuli without focusing on it. And this is called the working memory theory. You can pay attention to several stimuli and simultaneously store them for future reference. And most of us are doing this on a regular basis. So we can play on our phone while we're watching TV in a room full of people who are talking. So, in any given evening, when you're at home with your family, all of this stuff is going on. You're kind of half listening. You're kind of half paying attention. But ultimately, you're not really listening to anything. Listening, on the other hand, is dynamic, transactional process of receiving, recalling, and responding to stimuli, messages, or both. So listening is an active experience. Hearing is a passive experience. So the two little blocks here, hearing is accidental, involuntary, and effortless. Listening is focused, voluntary, and intentional. So let's talk about the 4 R's of listening. Number 1, receiving, verbal and nonverbal acknowledgement of a message. And this includes mindful listening, listening that requires one to be engaged with another person. Responding, providing feedback to a sender's message. Number 3, recalling, understanding a message, storing it for future encounters, and remembering it later. Number 4, rating, evaluating or assessing a message. These 4 R's of listening demand that we take an active role in the process. So let's talk about what it is to be a listener. And there are different styles of listeners. And this listening style is the predominant way we listen to the messages we hear. So first we're going to talk about people-centered listening. This is associated with a concern for other people's feelings and emotions. We're concerned with creating and maintaining positive relationships. It is easy often to become overly involved in people's lives, and we often lose our ability to be neutral, and we can be seen as intrusive. It's kind of the Oprah effect. We start probing, we start asking questions that might make the other people feel uncomfortable because we're asking personal questions, and it might not be an environment where personal questions are appropriate. Oftentimes, when you meet people who are people-centered listeners, they are in healthcare jobs. They are very people-centered humans, and as such, it's oftentimes they are drawn to those kinds of jobs where they want to help people. Then we have the action-centered listening style. And this is associated with listeners who want messages to be highly organized, concise, and error-free. They focus on what needs to happen and who needs to do what. They like structure, bullet points, numbered action items. They minimize emotional issues, which can have an adverse effect on business interactions, because you cannot dismiss the emotional aspect in a situation. Humans are emotional beings. You cannot see them as just widgets or blocks that can be moved from one place to another. They can be impatient and hurry speakers towards conclusions. And worse, they can lead them to appear overly concerned with control and less with the well-being of other people. Now, when is an action-centered listener appropriate? The military, police, firemen or women, fire people. When there is a situation that is very, very tense, an emergency, a situation that requires immediate action, this is when this kind of listening style becomes extremely important and becomes very advantageous. This would not necessarily work in an environment where being more people-centered would be appropriate. However, if you're a doctor in the ER, you need to be an action-centered person because the emergency room is dealing with emergencies. Then we have content-centered listeners. They are associated with a focus on the facts and details of a message. People who are content-centered listeners are more interested in what is being said than who is saying it or what that person is feeling. They assess people more by how credible they are. They look for both pros and cons in arguments, and they seek a solid, logical argument. However, they can run into trouble when they reject information because it does not have sufficient supporting evidence. It can also be time-consuming because they're going through all of the evidence, and they can be perceived as being overly analytical and being overly critical. Now, the perfect kind of job for somebody who's content-centered is a judge. They have to look at all sides of a situation. And anybody who has to make these kinds of decisions, a mediator, that is somebody who has to, look at both sides of a situation and make a decision that is going to essentially compromise or come to a conclusion for both parties. They have to make a decision based on all of the evidence. Then we have the time-centered listener. And this is with people who want their messages to be presented as succinctly as possible. They organize their day into neat little compartments, and they allocate a specific amount of time to listen to somebody. They are concerned primarily with the efficient use of time as a resource. And this focus on time can strain relationships. They want short, efficient answers, which undermines the speaker's attempts to explain an idea thoroughly. And this emphasis on time can undermine decision making. because some decisions may take longer to go through than just a 15 or 20 minutes that the meeting is scheduled for. So all aspects need to be examined, and if someone is focused on only having 15 minutes, then that is not enough time. And the decision could be made poorly because that person did not give enough time to make that decision. So let's talk about some of the barriers that we encounter to effective listening. Noise. And we've talked about this extensively in this class. And again, semantic, psychological, physical, and physiological noise all becomes a big problem. Then we have message overload, and this is something that you begin to experience on the job, especially when you move into management. It occurs when senders receive more messages than they can process. For example, you're at your desk with a client who is angry. Your phone rings off the hook, your cell phone is buzzing with text messages, and then somebody knocks on your office door. Your brain feels like it's going to explode because everybody wants a piece of you. And because everybody wants a piece of you, you're feeling overwhelmed. This overload is essentially your car overheating, and your brain is overheating because it doesn't know where to go first. So it's, in a sense, just saying, you know what? Just shutting down for a while. Then we have message complexity. Message complexity are messages that are overly detailed, include unfamiliar language, or have confusing and challenging arguments. So oftentimes you'll get an email that is so complicated that you have no idea what the person is talking about, or that the person assumes you already know what is being discussed, and as such, you have no idea. So you have to try and decipher this. The other thing that you oftentimes have to deal with is people who are, giving you information and they're assuming that you're already familiar with the scenario, but you're not. So you have to, again, try and get them to understand that you need more background. Environmental issues. Physical distractions, such as it's too cold in the room, it's too hot in the room, there's conversations going on in other parts of the room. You can be in an office, you're having a meeting, everything is going well. Suddenly outside your office, there's screaming and shouting, and there's a fight going on, and whatever listening you were doing ends because you need to know what's going on outside your office. So again, these environmental barriers are not necessarily poor listening skills. It's just sometimes situational issues. Lack of training. When are any of us taught how to listen? When we're little kids, our mom and dads tell us listen, but they don't tell us how to listen. When we're in kindergarten and first and second grade, we're told to listen with our ears. Well, duh. But we're, again, not taught how to listen. And then when we get to first and second and third grade and our teachers yell at us to sit still and be quiet and listen, no one is actually sitting down and saying to us, this is the process of listening. Then we get into egocentrism, which is when people don't listen because they believe their own ideas or opinions are far more important. And again, you see this a lot of times with bosses who underestimate the intelligence of their employees. So they may appear that they are listening, but they're really not because they know they're awesome and you're not. Another one that's very significant and very prevalent is the preoccupation with personal issues or business problems. So let's say you leave for work and just before you're leaving for work that morning, you have a big fight with your boyfriend or girlfriend, or your cat is really sick. Well, that might be the only thing on your mind that day. Meanwhile, your boss is explaining the big project you're being assigned to, and you're not really focused on it because all you can think about is what a jerk your boyfriend or girlfriend is. Or that your sick cat is probably dying at home alone while you are sitting there listening to your boss drone on and on. Then we have the fear of appearing ignorant, which is also very, very prevalent. People are afraid to seek clarification by asking a question because they don't want to look stupid. And that is especially true when we are surrounded by people we know, especially in our work environment. We don't want to look like we're the dumb one. We want to appear at least to be on par with our coworkers, if not more intelligent than them. Then we have conversational narcissism, which is the engaging in an extreme amount of self-focusing during a conversation to the exclusion of another person, which essentially means someone who always brings the conversation back to themselves as soon as they can. So, for example, let's say that you're just found out that you have diabetes. And you're telling your friend that you just found this out and you're really upset and you have to go on a diet and you have to start exercising and you have to cut sugar out of your diet. And then as soon as you take a breath, they start telling you that they're going to go on a paleo diet to support the idea that, modern diets are just bad and how they're going to feel better and it has nothing to do with your problem, and they're 2 seconds of support for you, letting you talk, is gone, and now it's all back about them. Then we have the listening gap. This is the time difference between the mental ability to interpret words and the speed at which they arrive at one's brain. And this is especially true when the news is either very, very good or very, very bad. And it takes a few seconds to process as we interpret or realize what the implications are. So when somebody tells you, for example, that a close friend or family member has passed away, there's that few seconds of shock as your brain is beginning to realize that you will never see that person again, that you'll never have the chance to talk to them again. And then it hits you. And it's the same thing with really good news. You've won the lottery, and it takes a second to go, oh my God, I've won the lottery. And as it begins to hit you again, that realization kicks in, and you realize, wow, I just won the lottery. My job. I can go be a bum on the beach for the rest of my life because I just won the lottery. And life is good. So let's talk about some incorrect assumptions about listening before we get to the techniques for listening. First, we assume that effective communication is the sender's responsibility. But in reality, the listener is responsible for ensuring they understand the message using feedback techniques. We also assume that listening is passive. You should ask questions and paraphrase information to ensure accuracy. So again, it's not a passive activity. We have to participate in the listening activity. We assume that talking is more advantageous than listening. The higher up you are in the company, the more listening you do. So really, listening is the priority role. Then we have poor listening habits. And one of the most popular is selective or spot listening. And this is responding to some parts of a message and rejecting others. So if you look at the comic on the right on top, You have the woman, she's reading the newspaper, and she says, Al Gore's son was arrested in a Prius going over 100 miles an hour with possession of marijuana and prescription drugs. And the husband says, wow, a Prius can do 100 miles an hour? So clearly, his spot listening was the fact that a hybrid car can do 100 miles an hour, not the fact that the former vice president's son was arrested speeding with drugs in his car. Now, the strategy to overcome this is you have to embrace the whole message. Secondly, we have what's called talkaholism. A talkaholic is a compulsive talker who hogs the conversational stage and monopolizes encounters. These are the people who just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. They can be sitting at a table with 20 people and they're the ones who dominate every element of the conversation. These talkaholics need to understand that they have a problem. And if you are a talkaholic, you need to recognize that other people would like to contribute as well. The strategy to overcome this is pace your participation conversation. Let 3 or 4 people talk, then you contribute. Then let 3 or 4 people talk, then you contribute. Pace yourself. Pseudo-listening. Many of us do this, especially when we're at home with our families. We pretend to listen by pretending to pay attention. We nod our head, we look at the speaker, we smile at appropriate times. The strategy to overcome is to actually pay attention. Now, sometimes the person who's talking is just rambling about something, and maybe it's time to say, I'm reading this book or watching this show. Can you just give me 20 minutes and then I'll listen? But, the reality is sometimes they're actually giving you good information. Like pick up milk tomorrow morning. Then we have the gap fillers. These are the listeners who think that they can correctly guess the rest of the story a speaker is telling, and they don't need the speaker to continue. This is the worst, because you're telling a story and they just jump in and say, oh, let me guess, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, no, that's not what happened. And they go, oh, well, did this happen? And you're like, no. And you go on and on. You're like, really? You just ruined my entire story. So the strategy to overcome this, if you are a gap filler, is to shut up. Don't say anything. Wait to see if you're right or wrong. Keep it in your own head. Keep that inside voice inside. Then we have defensive listening, and we do this at home with our love muffins all the time. We view an innocent comment as a personal attack or a hostile criticism. So if somebody says, oh, you know what, I'm just really tired today. I don't think I'm going to be up for cooking tonight. And then your love muffin says, oh, are you saying that I never cook? Is that the problem? Well, the love muffin is taking it a little bit too defensively, because you didn't say you need to cook tonight because you never cook. No, you're just saying, I'm not feeling great, I don't want to cook. So the strategy to overcome being a defensive listener is just to kind of keep your self-concept in check. This comic on the right, I just love this. Why do you always get defensive whenever I attack you? An attack is so much different than an innocent comment. Then we have ambushers. These are people who listen carefully to a message and then use that information later to attack the sender. Ambushers like to use anything you say against you at a later time. Much like the police, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of my law. So 3 years ago, you said my butt looked big in those pants. So for the next 27 years of our relationship, I'm going to bring that up every time we fight. And of course, consequently, it just becomes a giant pain in the butt to deal with it, so you just never say anything. So now let's talk about effective listening. First thing you got to do is evaluate your current skills. Are you a good listener? Minimize your distractions and take time to listen, especially in important conversations. Put the cell phone away when you're having a conversation. This has been a huge bone of contention, not only in personal relationships, but in work situations. Many bosses prefer employees to put their phones away during meetings because they find them distracting, and more importantly, they know the employee is not really paying attention. Talk less, interrupt less. Provide empathetic responses. What is empathy? Empathy is the ability to identify with or attempt to experience the thoughts, beliefs, and actions of another. So, as we look at effective listening, we have to not just minimize distractions, be there for the person, but we also have to try and identify with how they're feeling. So, effective listening. Seek verbal and observe nonverbal feedback. Use non-judgmental feedback, which describes another's behavior and explains how that behavior made one feel. Meaning, use the I messages versus the you messages. Ask questions to clear up any confusion. Paraphrase. So you're going to paraphrase content. So we'll talk after dinner, which is at 6. Paraphrase intent. So you're doing this to see who's interested. Paraphrase feelings. You seem disappointed. And again, what you're doing is trying to ensure that you understand how this person is feeling, what they're saying, or what they want to do. And whether it's something as simple as dinner plans or they're expressing how they feel about a relationship, you want to make sure you understand the accurate information. Effective listening and feedback continued. You want to listen for key points. You want to keep your eye on them because, again, it's also about non-verbal communication, that body language. Take notes. Repeat information. You want to analyze the speaker's evidence. If they're just giving you all kinds of BS, and it's not real facts, it's BS, then you know it's not valid, good information. Examine emotional appeals, especially if you're feeling manipulated. That spidey sense that you get in the back of your neck that something is not quite right, that's actually your gut instinct. Now, what is gut instinct? Gut instinct is not your gut. It is your experiences that you've had in your life that are basically telling you that you shouldn't trust what's happening because there's something wrong. So that gut instinct that we like to refer to, or our spidey sense, is telling us that the person we are communicating with is manipulating us. And we have to respect our gut instinct because it is based on our experiences. So, what is active listening? It is when a listener uses those communication techniques that reinforce their understanding of a message to a speaker. So, essentially, throughout communications, we've been talking about this concept extensively. Paraphrasing, restating the essence of a sender's message in one's own words. Dialogue enhancers, supporting statements that indicate one's involvement in a conversation, especially on the phone. Saying okay at appropriate times will help build rapport with the person speaking. If you've ever been on the phone with somebody who is completely silent, occasionally you're like, are you still there? Because, phone calls drop all the time, especially with cell phones. Ask well-timed and appropriate questions. Silent listening face to face, listening attentively and non-verbally to another person, meaning nodding, smiling, keeping eye contact. Be aware of inconsistent emotions, especially if they appear inappropriate to the situation. If somebody is sobbing to you, but they don't appear upset any other way, their body language doesn't appear to be upset, there's something else going on. Any inconsistencies, you always want to look at the body language. Body language or nonverbal communication is more likely to be true than what comes out of somebody's mouth. And you always want to remember that. So we're going to finish up talking about a very practical skill set, which is how to listen when a customer or a client is upset and is complaining. Some large companies have a very specific process, but a lot of small companies don't, and this process works very well. First, take notes. Record the facts. This is especially helpful face-to-face because it shows you're taking the complaint very seriously. And it also forces the person who's complaining to slow down so that you can take the notes. So it kind of takes some of the wind out of their sails so they're not yelling and screaming and throwing things and slamming their hand down. However, you should allow the critic to vent before you respond at all. This will give the client an opportunity to relieve his or her frustration because, it's like a tea kettle. Once it boils, it has to whistle to let you know, and it's letting off steam. Well, let them let off steam, and then you can have a conversation. Remember, just because you listen doesn't mean you're agreeing. Make sure you understand the problem, and this is where you use your active listening techniques to clarify the issue. Empathize with the complainer. Again, you don't have to agree, but you can see their point. Yes, I understand why you are upset. You're not agreeing, but you're seeing their point. Tell the complainer what actions you intend to take to help them out. In other words, what they want to do is get something done, and what they want to hear from you is what you're going to do. You want to follow up with the complainer so they know what you have done. Again, this shows that you care about their concern and that you are actively trying to help them. People want to be heard. That's the biggest thing. And by following up, you will demonstrate how much you have tried. So even if you don't solve all of their issues, you have demonstrated the highest level of professionalism, you've demonstrated that the client was heard, and you've demonstrated that you have done what you could do to get them satisfaction. So if they do go to your boss to, take it up the chain of command, you've done everything you could possibly do, and you know that your boss can't come back to you and say, well, why didn't you do X, Y, and Z? Because you already did X, Y, and Z. So, that's it for this presentation. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to text or email me. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for listening.